Okay, it's 3 minutes past 2. I'm sure people will be arriving as we begin, but I have promised a prompt start, and we have quite a strict schedule to keep to this session. So I'll begin. Hello everyone and welcome. I'm Susan Poisson-Locke and I'm an artist, writer, researcher and director of the Decolonising Arts Institute. Before I introduce today's event, which I will be moderating very lightly, allow me to run through a few reminders. Firstly, if you haven't already, please do mute your mics and turn off your cameras. Secondly, if you have any questions and comments, do feel free to post these to the chat box. And if you find you have any access issues with the chat window, please email Hannah, our administrator, at Decolonising Arts Institute at arts.ac.uk, and she can post your questions or comments on your behalf. There will be a Q&A segment to the afternoon, and if you wish to speak during this time, please use the raise hand function. And if you require live captions at any point, you can access these via the 3 dots on your menu bar. We have a slide here to indicate where that is if you're not familiar with it. It may pop up at any point. Finally, please be aware that the event is being recorded. So if you would prefer to keep your mics off and videos off during the Q&A, that's absolutely fine. A link will be shortly circulated after the event, and any links posted to the chat will also be collated and circulated with the recording link. Some background to begin with. The Decolonising Arts Institute has been in development since late 2018 and is currently in pilot phase. Some of you may be aware that the Institute had a number of events planned for the spring and summer, which, like many, we've had to postpone and rethink, not only in response to COVID, but also in light of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. We published an Institute newsletter at the end of July, laying out our activities in progress and upcoming plans. If you haven't received this and would like to, again, do email us. And in this newsletter, you will see that in lieu of a single launch moment for which we are very much and perhaps need to be perpetually in formation, we're reframing this year as an extended pilot phase with a programme of practice, research and engagement, very much informed by the pandemic and its disproportionate impacts, which only serve to underscore ongoing social injustices and inequalities. We're currently redeveloping our web pages to spotlight some of this activity, as well as to highlight and support various important existing initiatives across UAL, such as GEMS, Shades of Noir, and projects led by the Arts SU. The pilot programme will feature a range of internal and public-facing events to generate discussion, connection, collaboration, and action. And these include a series of conversations and roundtables between, with, or led by the Institute's associate researchers, along with colleagues, artists and art workers within UAL and more widely in the arts and education sectors. We held our first In Conversation event in July with Dr. Anjalie Dalal-Clayton, our Institute Research Fellow, and Hammad Nasar, a Principal Research Fellow with the Institute based at Central St Martin's. And we are very pleased to welcome you today to our second conversation with artist researchers Khairani Barokka and Annabel Crowley. Before I introduce our speakers, let me quickly flag the format for the next hour and a half. There will be 3 15-minute conversations with a 5-minute comfort break between each. The first conversation is on crises, the second is on responses, and the third is on accountabilities. We'll then have some time for Q&A, so again, do post any questions or comments to the chat box. So the title of today's event, this Artist Researchers in Conversation, is Art School in a Pandemic. Focusing on the recent exhibition research and writing projects of artists Khairani, Barokka and Annabel Crowley, Oka and Annabel will discuss their shared interest in how the COVID-19 pandemic has altered the landscape of learning in art schools. They ask, what are the crucial and often overlooked contexts from an anti-colonial disability justice perspective? Why do they matter for everyone engaged with an art school today? They will contextualise teaching and learning in the current crisis and inquire into the conversations we should all be having. Khairani Barokka, known as Oka, is an Indonesian writer, artist and researcher in London whose work has been presented extensively in 15 countries. She's currently Research Fellow at the Decolonising Arts Institute and one of 4 researchers in residence on the Institute's Decolonising Archives programme, which is a partnership with the Archives and Special Collections Centre here at UAL. Oka is also Associate Artist at the National Centre for Writing, and among her honours, she was an NYU Tisch Departmental Fellow, Modern Poetry and Translations Inaugural Poet in Residence, and a UNFPA Indonesian Young Leader Driving Social Change. Her interdisciplinary work has been an art forum must-see, and her most recent book is a debut poetry collection called Rope, published by Nine Arches Press. Her work centres disability justice as anti-colonial praxis. You'll see some links to Oka's practice and research popping up in the chat now. Annabel de Antara Crowley is an artist, researcher and teacher from South London of Indonesian and Irish lineage. She has worked in and around disability as a professional since 2008 and in embodied and personal capacities for most of her life. In her role as Teaching, Learning and Attainment Coordinator at Central St Martin's, Annabel designs and delivers staff development interventions into teaching and learning practices with a particular focus on improving the experience, progress and attainment of marginalised students. As an artist, Annabel's recent shows, Neurodiversions 1 and 2, both 2019, have taken place in tandem with her current MA research into cultures of neurodivergence. Again, some links to Annabel's practice should be appearing in the chat. So I'm going to hand over now to Oka and Annabel for the first of 3 conversations titled Crises.
Thank you so much, Susan, for introducing us. So thank you to all of you for attending. Annabel and I are really excited about sharing this conversation with all of you. Please feel free to formulate your questions as they arise. So we chose Crises Multiple as the title for this first episode, this first part of the series. Because crises, they are multiple and intersecting. And we constantly are asking each other, who are we as people affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, affiliated with UAL, who are the myriad populations that are represented among the faculty, staff, and students at UAL and those affiliated with the university. What is actually going on, which is, I'm sure, a question that we're all asking on a daily basis and have been asking since the beginning of the pandemic. And what indeed is the quote-unquote new normal? What was, in fact, the old normal? And what are we looking towards in the future? Annabel and I are both disabled women of what we're choosing to call the majority world, which is a term that we prefer to encapsulate our heritages as opposed to Western ideas of very Eurocentric, very Anglo-centric notion of what is actually the minority world. We're both disabled women of Indonesian heritage. Actually, our mums come from villages not far from each other. And both of us have been noticing that all this talk of the new normal, quote unquote, does not include our communities, dismisses and ignores our scholarship, does not cite us, does not cite the lineages of disability, justice, scholarship, and artistic work and community work around illness, around survival, around living in late stage capitalism and what to do when the world seems to be crumbling, does not let our communities lead when they should be leading, does not include us in any kind of conversation about whatever a new normal is, quote unquote, what the old normal was, what we will be looking towards, even though these communities, disabled communities, perhaps we might call them disabled communities of color, of the majority world, have accumulated so much wisdom from before the pandemic and through it. We are amazingly in a global pandemic of illness being sidelined as people who have dealt with illness throughout lifetimes, and that is quite remarkably, it's an overwhelming testament to the power of ableist, colonial, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy.
Wow, what an opener, Oka. I think you're really right, though. I'm thinking about the long history of campaigns and direct action just in the UK, in the context that I'm familiar with. You know, the context of austerity in the UK, 10 years of deliberate defunding of crucial health and social care services and the privatisation of those services. And thinking about how, you know, a lot of what's been deemed, quote unquote, non-urgent care and services have been withdrawn further since the onset of COVID. You know, we're in the context of the deaths of thousands of disabled people, you know, a genocide of disabled people in the UK. And COVID, you know, in this context is only really the most recent / efficient killing of disabled people globally and in the UK. You know, disabled people are approximately 11 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than non-disabled people.
That's disabled women, yeah.
You know, 11 times. I think of my years working in the social care sector and how that time really moved me along from a disability rights framework to a disability justice one, you know, thinking about how rights have become for me an inadequate framework to think about this. You know, rights are reserved for very select groups of disabled people, contingent on the charity of state decision makers that has been hugely absent for the last decade. You know, the violence of austerity in the last 10 years has taught me that the concept of personhood and entitlement to rights is still steeped in the eugenicist legacies of Enlightenment philosophy. And so when thinking about the current crisis and thinking about the huge amounts of work, labour, knowledge production that have been taking place amongst disabled people, and especially disabled people of colour, you know, for me, disability justice starts to account more for the complexity of our lives and strives for liberation over survival.
That's really well said. And we just like to say that the term disability justice, which is Annabel eloquently described, is preferable to us than disability rights, which is more, you know, very neoliberal notion of personhoods and citizenship. Disability justice is a term coined by queer artist of color collective Sins Invalid from North America, even though they're very rarely cited, right, as the first progenitors of that term. As I wrote in a recent Art Monthly article entitled How to Make Art in a Pandemic, the idea of the art world as an inherent good needs to be held in the light of how the art world, quote unquote, particularly as we know it here in the UK, the fine arts world, benefits from capitalist, extractive, colonialist policies. And what I mean by that is that, as we all know, the financial flows that allow for the funding of arts schools, such as UAL, of the arts institutions that we work with in the UK, often come from very wealthy donors who have stakes in countries such as mine, Indonesia, which is also, you know, part of Annabel's heritage, in operations, whether mining, palm oil plantations, other sources of deforestation and pollution, and general endangerment of people and disabling of people. So on the one hand, for instance, as I said in the article, you might have new accessibility measures that are funded in a UK arts institution by a donor who has derived that money from the disablement of people in Indonesia by polluting, deforestation, forcible land capture and removal, and all of this interconnectedness of the neoliberal capitalist framework is something that I think people don't think about enough when you're just speaking about a very nationalist UK border control defined parameter of this current crisis and where we go. Because when we speak about resetting or going back to normal, quote unquote, what people often speak about is the very capitalist practices and the very extractive practices that have exacerbated this crisis to begin with. Annabel mentioned these horrible statistics that reflect a real genocide of disabled people. In fact, I think there was a recent study that showed in the UK, out of the many thousands who have perished from COVID-19, about 2/3 were disabled people. And many of these disabled people come from communities that are already endangered to begin with, who perhaps, although they live in the UK, have roots, have family in places that are not in the UK, that are being endangered by people from within the UK. So the art world, quote unquote, has had a clear hand in perpetuating trauma and multiple crises. The art world as a nexus of capital and capital flows, and keeping it in certain places rather than directing it towards communities such as the ones Annabel's worked with that have really needed this funding for our health and for our survival. I often look at Jasbir Puar's book, The Right to Maim from 2017, to look at this interconnectedness of capital flows, including art schools, right, and arts institutions, and how they've contributed to just how many people are currently suffering, are currently becoming disabled, are currently not here with us, who have passed away because of this breaking down of the social safety net. And therefore, we as practitioners of the arts within the UK and as members of UK art schools have to acknowledge our complicity in endangering people not only in the UK, but around the world.
Thank you, Orka. We were really already in crisis, and who's been most impacted by these crises is global. I'm thinking, I really like how you've woven, I appreciate how you've woven art schools into this kind of interconnected flows globally. And I think as well about how that crisis exists within the art schools themselves that are situated in the UK. Thinking about crisis of racial harassment as written about in the report by the Equality and Human Rights Commission just last year. I'm going to put a link in the chat. I'm thinking about how since the onset of COVID-19 we've rapidly shifted into online teaching modes, and that I read the recent report by Inclusion London that pulled from the Office for National Statistics about how disabled people are disproportionately represented amongst internet non-users. I think if you imagine that 56% of all the people in the UK that don't use the internet are disabled, compared with 22% of the overall population is estimated to be disabled. That's being more than doubly represented amongst people who don't use the internet. In this shift to online teaching, in this crisis, in this response to crisis, this reliance on the online, who gets left out of that? Who gets marginalised again? The same people that have not been allowed into the building prior to COVID-19, who we don't find at art schools, still find themselves marginalised in the online mode as much as in the physical mode. I'm thinking as well about how much evidence has arisen about the disproportionate impact of ableist structures on Black disabled people in the UK, and about the intersectionality of disability. you know, how Black Lives Matter is seen as a crisis that kind of operates in parallel to COVID, but actually is very much overlaid, and it's not a new crisis as well.
Yeah, you and I have both learned so much from the Black disabled activists and artists that we are in community with. Black Lives Matter has always been timely and urgent since it began in the early 2000s, early mid 2000s, and it is not a now moment. You know, recently Silver Press did this amazing series called "Revolution is Not a One-Time Event," which I highly suggest you look up, because it is not just, you know, and it's not just the death of George Floyd, contrary to many PR supported statements by arts institutions, right? It's so many deaths of Black people in the UK and in the US, including those endangered even more by COVID because of structural racism and institutional racism, including the Black artist and staff, student, faculty that consider themselves members of UAL, who have been clamoring at UAL and other art schools for racism to be addressed and abolition to be enacted for long, long before this COVID-19 crisis. We will send you links in the email following this event if you want to connect and help our Black colleagues in the movement, who should always be leading the movement, especially our Black disabled colleagues, whether in the States, in the UK, and elsewhere. What we're dealing with right now, as you said, Annabel, very rightly, Black Lives Matter and COVID-19, they're part of the same crises. They're part of the same traumatic multiple crises. The pandemic interconnects with multiple supremacisms and systems, multiple countries, multiple positionalities.
And when I think about that, you know, this vast context, and how often crisis pushes us to think about the now, you know, I'm having to ground myself and ask, you know, who has been doing this work? You know, I can speak to UAL in terms of the UAL lineages that I'm part of. You know, GEMS, as mentioned by Susan in the intro, the Group for the Equality of Minority Staff, you know, UAL's largest and longest standing staff network representing Black staff and staff of colour, was founded 21 years ago this year. So in 1999 was founded by Avril Horsford, sadly not with UAL anymore. I think about Shades of Noir, founded in 2009 by Aisha Richards. I think about Dee Janeja, you know, who single-handedly and voluntarily chaired UAL's disabled and neurodiverse staff network for more than a decade. I think about all of the campaigns by student unions, you know, across the UK, actually, against the enforcement of borders and policing within universities. I think of Goldsmith's anti-racist action, you know, ongoing since last year with the occupation of Deptford Town Hall. I think of the student occupations at UAL. You know, I've only personally witnessed the one that took place at LCC. So yes, you know, I think we should respond to the current moment, but let's not forget our lineages. You know, I think about Adrienne Marie Brown in her book Emergent Strategy, and how in the introduction to that book she writes an explicit lineage of how she got there, you know, on whose foundations she's now situated. So I think it's important to ask ourselves in the current crisis, whose sacrifices, labour and knowledges carved the path for us.
That's really brilliantly put. Thank you all of us for joining us for this first part. And I think Susan will introduce the break.
Okay, welcome back everyone. We now come to the second of 3 conversations titled Responses. Please post any questions and comments you have to the chat box and we'll come back to them in the Q&A. Oka and Annabel, back to you.
Thank you so much, Susan. I hope everyone had a good break. We first discussed crises, and now we're going to discuss the responses to those crises. The response to intersecting crises in the media in the UK and mainstream media internationally has largely involved the erasure of disabled and chronically ill people from the conversation about the pandemic. So firstly, we need to acknowledge the appropriation of illness narratives. What's really triggering and quite traumatizing for our communities is that issues that we had been campaigning for, as I mentioned, lifetimes, and trying to get into the conversation, were wholly ignored for such a long time. And now the illness is literally at the forefront of everyone's minds. We're not even being included in the conversation. There's no acknowledgement that we do have a rich history of scholarship and of creation in response to this, that we have developed methods for survival that could benefit everyone. It's really quite amazing and awful how, for instance, when universities switched to online learning, not many universities and arts institutions, or online exhibitions, as you will, actually consulted with disabled and chronically ill people about how we had been doing this for, since the beginning of the internet, right? Disabled people had been asking, how do we make things actually accessible? And contrary to popular opinion, it's not just about putting everything online and that's a quick fix. As Annabel said, there's so many disabled people who are non-users of the internet. And in addition to that, there are people such as Amy Hamray. I apologize if I'm not pronouncing their name right. It's A-I-M-E, first name, H-A-M-R-A-I-E. Second name will include a link to their directive for accessible teaching and learning in the COVID-19 environment with the other materials. But they, have really developed how to teach and learn in a way that is accessible. It's not about just putting things online. For a lot of people who are chronically ill, like both of us, we do require comfort breaks. We do require, there are people of different neurodivergent identities who require different things, who need to be included in the conversation. And there is an art to this. There is a craft to this that has been developed. There is a way to do accessible conference making that it has been pioneered by, in the States, Black disabled women who have been doing, whose method for making accessible conferences is often copied, rarely cited, right, as intellectual labor. It's not just, once again, in terms of extractivism, it's always expected that we as disabled and chronically ill artists, researchers are asked to give solutions, right, provide solutions, and that we will do this out of the goodness of our heart. We don't need to be cited or compensated. This has been going on our whole lives, right? And the fact that it's either A, not going on at all, or B, going on with such a, such an exploitative way at a period when a genocide of our people is not even being acknowledged, and is continuing to be perpetuated. Whenever I see, or hear about the new normal, I think about how incredibly ableist this response is as a response to the crisis. Because invariably, when I hear whether government ads or corporate ads, or just general conversation about the new normal, quote unquote, it does not have any conception of how we are suffering as communities now as disabled and chronically ill people. And it makes me feel as though, people will think we're out of the crisis when non-disabled people are out of the crisis. But we as disabled and chronically ill people, who are the largest minority of the world, who comprise, I think, Annabel, we had a conversation, like 22% of the UK. This is not a niche, it's not a niche market. This is 22% of the UK have been decimated, continue to be endangered, and to really just be treated in such terrible ways, and to have illness discussed in ways that are really ableist, because people often, if you're steeped in this, pervasive capitalist ableism, you don't have the vocabulary to speak about illness in a way that is, in accordance with ethics. You don't have the knowledge and the tools, and you think that everyone is starting from zero, right? As though, oh my gosh, we don't know what to do. This is unprecedented, which, by the way, it wasn't, because obviously, as Native Americans can tell you, pandemics and eugenics have gone together and have been happening for quite a long time. So, responses in art schools that don't cite existing disability-led scholarship and activism, especially Black and majority world disabled women and non-binary led scholarship and activism, people who have pioneered accessible teaching and learning in conferences, really needs to be reconsidered. In Indonesia, as with in the UK and elsewhere, there's been a really inadequate and inconsistent government response, but also some really wonderful artist-led mutual aid initiatives. We're talking, I joined during the pandemic beginnings, I joined a Zoom call led by Jati Wangi Art Factory, which is this wonderful village-based, community-led residency program that I did in Indonesia. And the people participating in the Zoom came from all over internationally. And it was wonderful to see initiatives like MES 56 in Yogyakarta. It's an artist space. And people were asking, what are you doing for artists during this pandemic? They were like, we are literally feeding artists. That artist space became a place, sort of like a soup kitchen, where artists could go breakfast, lunch, and dinner to eat, literal starving artists, right, during this pandemic. And that's when you talk about how is art going to continue, what is the continuance of the art world, that needs to be linked to the survival of artists' body minds and the actual survival of artists, many of whom are disabled and chronically ill, not responses that exacerbate eugenics, as is currently the case.
I think eugenics is a really important concept here. I've personally seen a lot of responses that are eugenicist and eco-fascist. These kind of narratives of humans are the virus, these myths of overpopulation that fail to analyze global consumption, emissions patterns as colonial in and of themselves. We see racist health outcomes happen in real time. In the UK, there is an increased probability for Black people, especially, and people of colour to contract COVID-19 and to fall critically ill with it. It's a combination of racist housing, employment, as well as healthcare systems. When we see in real time the UK government's avoidant response to the overwhelming body of evidence for institutional racism impacting on outcomes for COVID-19 for different groups of the population. We saw do not resuscitate forms sent to learning disabled people and older people, which really just provokes the question of, whose lives are deemed worthy? Who's deemed worthy of having their life saved? And how are these measures of worthiness embedded into COVID-19 narratives so seamlessly? This whole time, I read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine probably between 5 and 7 years ago, a long time ago. And I'm really thinking about it at the moment in terms of how crisis is exploited to establish controversial and violent policies.
Like herd immunity, quote unquote, which was
herd immunity. It it comes in the same breath as eugenics. This idea, that there's a certain amount of death that is acceptable because it's of weaker people in the population. It's eugenics. So thinking about how crises are exploited in terms of the shock that the population is in. Citizens are distracted and overwhelmed by COVID-19 as a crisis, emotionally and physically, and thinking about how they're unable then, how we become collectively unable to engage and develop adequate responses to eugenics as perpetuated by states, and how can we resist effectively when we're in a collective state of shock?
Right. And I think the response from art schools is generally to sort of have this sort of blanket idea that the we are affected by the COVID-19 pandemic is non-disabled people, right? And for disabled and chronically ill people, the reaction there, because it's not disability led, which again is like, it's so important. I really don't think people understand this enough. Any response has to be disability led. And we see, we've talked about this, we see commissions and we see initiatives about illness and isolation being given to non-disabled artists and non-disabled initiatives and non-disabled organizations when, for decades, these disabled and chronically ill communities have been asking for funding, have been asking for respect, have been asking for wider, dissemination of ideas and propositions and very detailed understandings of body, minds, and illness and what that does to the arts, right? And it's really shocking. It's completely shocking that people who have been forced to isolate for, I'm not saying it's not hard, but honestly, for months as compared to lifetimes, right? And you have to imagine the people who have been mocked for taking photos with masks on, like our colleague Alice Wong, in the States, right? Who have to wear masks, were mocked for taking photos with masks on, and now it's become a trend. All of us who have been, sidelined for, they talk about disability too much, they're the disability person, they talk about illness too much, sidelined. And now, during a global pandemic, that conversation is taken up by completely ableist narratives and people who don't understand that they're perpetuating those completely ableist narratives and eugenicist narratives. So I think it's really, I don't think people understand enough how we're feeling within our communities to have this happen to us on a global scale.
I think as well about how invisible some of that work becomes. Like,
to whom?
Oh, totally. I think about, I'm a member of UAL's Disabled and Neurodiverse Staff Network, and I'm going to drop a link into the chat that I think is really interesting for this, because a lot of people since the onset of COVID-19 have been talking about the impact of it on memory and concentration, essentially, in the area of what's called executive function in the medical field. As a neurodivergent person, this is the exact experience that I've had to mitigate against for all of my life, thinking about how, work, education, the whole of society is structured to take place in a very linear fashion, to have very able normative assumptions about our ability to navigate, the structures of society. And suddenly a lot of people are experiencing a lot of, the ways of their minds working that mine has always worked this way. And so I find myself doing a lot of, voluntary work to support my peers, to support my non-disabled peers, people in my life who've never experienced this once, and all of a sudden it's like, you have so much knowledge, and I think, well, yeah, I do.
Yeah, we do. And I think you and I were both speaking about how, all of a sudden, although there have been many responses that were not adequate, the responses that were helpful, such as, the ability to work from home for people who, like us, have issues of who are neurodivergent and or disabled and or chronically ill, were at the drop of a hat in a matter of days, because non-disabled people were affected. These policies were enacted. And I don't think people understand enough that the lack of these policies that we have been asking for, we've literally been severely injured by these policies not being given to us. I really don't think people understand that we have been physically harmed and injured by lack of access. I think people are just like, oh, it's okay, I'm so sorry, I didn't know, all of this. And it's really, now that non-disabled people understand how vital these policies are, now it's being enacted. And that in itself is pretty traumatic. You can look up the hashtag accessibility for ableds if you'd like to really delve into how angry our communities are about this.
Yeah,
this was available all along.
It should have been available all along, but then you think about how legal frameworks, in the context of education and employment, we're talking about art schools. I'm thinking about the parameters of the Equality Act 2010, the piece of legislation that introduced this idea of quote unquote reasonable adjustments. And I think about how, prior to COVID-19, if anyone like me or like Oka were requesting adjustments to the way that we work, imagine we're requesting flexible working or remote working, for example, two kind of key factors in the current crisis that have had to change for the large portions of the workforce. Those requests would be measured against able normative ideas of reasonableness. Yes. Like standards of reasonableness that prioritize business need over individuals, over the health and safety of individuals, right? And now all of a sudden it's like a moment of feeling like I've been gaslighted for however many years straight, because all of a sudden the request that I'd been making for adjustments and all of this kind of fuss over how reasonable it is or unreasonable, how reasonable or unreasonable I am in existing in the way that I do and trying to access my workplace. So all of a sudden, there's no need for such gatekeeping around access.
Yeah, it's painful. It's painful, and it is gaslighting. It's institutional gaslighting across the board, across all art schools that's going on, and
wider society.
in wider society. And it really is also, I think this sort of discounting of our prior scholarship and contributions goes along with the charity model of disability a lot when it is enacted. And that's also very problematic, right? To see us as sort of a population that needs taken care of, that needs to be taken care of. Thank you all for listening to part 2. And we hope you join us again for the wrap up, part 3.
Welcome back again. We now come to the third of our 3 conversations titled Accountabilities. Do post any questions or comments to the chat and we'll come to these shortly. Oka and Annabel, back to you.
Thank you, Susan. So yeah, welcome to part 3 of our conversation. We've entitled this Accountabilities because we think it's a good point to end on when thinking about next steps and where we all go from here in terms of these conversations. For me, when I think about accountability, I start by reflecting on my own positionality. So, thinking back on SIN's invalids principles of disability justice, one of those principles is being led by those who are most impacted by the issue at hand. I will speak to my own experience of being invited to speak, for example, on anti-Black racism since the second wave of Black Lives Matter movement started, and having to really refuse and challenge these invitations. Will any person of colour do? Should we be interchangeable, or can we move beyond that within art schools to be led by those most impacted as per SIN's invalids principles of disability justice? I think about both personal and institutional accountability practices. On the personal level, I really love Mia Mingus's sheer generosity when in writing How to Give a Genuine Apology, parts 1 and 2. I'll put a link in the chat for that in a moment. At an institutional level, I'm really thinking about Black working class led communities who've been working for a long time to develop practices in mutual aid and transformative justice. I think about the Black Panther movement, both in the UK and the US, and how much we can potentially learn from practices of accountability that don't historically or traditionally find themselves within art schools.
Yes, I think that of late, care, the word, and however people are interpreting that word, has become a buzzword in the arts, but rarely have events post the onset of COVID-19 with regards to care in large arts organizations been disability-led, been disability majority world-led. The onus should not be on us to educate for free, to quote-unquote inspire, or to prop up people who perform allyship as an extractive optical activity. Our efforts long before COVID-19 to get access needs met that are only now being enacted because the non-disabled require them needs to be recognized. As mentioned in part 2, we have injured ourselves severely in attempts to get access and trying to work in art school settings where access has been promised and not given. And once again, this is for faculty, staff, and students. I think that the racism that has always been there as part of colonial arts institutions, as combined with the COVID-19 pandemic, has resulted in an acuteness of the need for care. But the way care is enacted in arts organizations doesn't always reflect how it should be. Of course, we're both recommending the book Care, Dreaming Disability Justice. I believe you have it, Annabel, yes, by Leah Lakshmi Pipsna Samarasinha, who is also a poet and part of SIN's Invalid, I believe. And I encourage everyone to read that. But I also encourage everyone to, if you are working with care at all, if you are working on the pandemic at all, if you are even referencing the pandemic at all, please make initiatives disability-led. This means disabled and chronically ill curators, artists, facilitators, managers, because we do have the knowledge. And if you don't make it disability-led, all you're doing is making more work for yourself by trying to catch up to all the knowledge that we've already accumulated from a lifetime and probably not citing us. So that's where we're at currently.
I think of the like the centralization of power in arts institutions and how these models of bureaucracy are colonial in nature.
Yes.
And how I think about what are the possibilities for decentralizing that power so that we have smaller hierarchies in areas of expertise and specialism and skill. If we think about mechanisms for collective care in particular, I'm thinking about how we challenge the really entrenched individualism that exists, in the UK and in many kind of former colonizing powers. I say former with a lot of cynicism.
No, current colonizing powers, if we're being honest, right?
Yeah. So I'm thinking, like, how can we try to transform the ways, the mechanisms of care that exist within institutions while their structures of power mimic colonial bureaucracies?
Yes, I think that the issue of landlessness and lack of resources and lack of care stems directly from colonial land grab, which is ongoing, right, around the world, with centralization of power and resources in the center periphery model, which very much favors a Eurocentric notion of power nodes, including within the art world. And I think in terms of accountabilities, I think a lot of people aren't really grasping that these violences have long histories, right? I don't think people grasp enough that these violences aren't just recent, that they aren't just segmented off, right, into, okay, this is a pandemic response, this is the Black Lives Matter response, this is the, this is the need for mutual aid response. Mutual aid initiatives especially by disabled and chronically ill artists recognize these long histories of colonialism and recognize the futures of colonialism, that the responses to the pandemic is actually foretelling, and which is really quite terrifying. And I think more attention needs to be paid to that. And this can't be just a band-aid within art schools to just say, okay, this is currently the pandemic, we're going to move on, because it's all so interlinked that the more you ignore the genocide that has happened, the continued killing of disabled and chronically ill populations, including in the arts, the more you're going to have this ongoing continuation of the pandemic. So it's literally a self-perpetuating thing. And still, it is our communities sort of being in shock amongst ourselves, saying, we've asked for this to be addressed our whole lives. Now it's being addressed in the wrong way.
And also being appropriated. I'm thinking Eshek Yamazuri wrote about the Black roots of mutual aid groups. I'm going to put a link written for Galdem recently. There are long histories, long lineages. I can't emphasize this enough. And I think about the violence that is erasure.
Yeah.
And how that itself is a colonial tool.
Yeah.
This erasure of the history. I think, wow, where are we that we see appropriation of mutual aid, which is essentially like cooperation within communities to care for each other in a sustainable way,
and
right?
this whole concept of self-care, which has become corporatized since before the COVID-19 pandemic, came from, organizations like Black Panther talking about self-care because the government would not give them healthcare, right? So how do you care for yourself as part of a community? And I really see the sort of the meshing of corporate interest with illness narratives, which is unlike any that I've seen in my lifetime, at least, to be incredibly disturbing. And I don't think it's going over the line to say, as we've said, that our illness narratives are being appropriated, and also the focus being on people who are new to COVID-19, not connecting them with us, right? Because we can help, we really can. And I think that that's, that erasure is contributing to literal erasure of bodies and experiences. And I want, if anybody out there is listening, who has been newly affected by COVID-19 or, wants to reach out, please know that you are not alone. And I think that there are a lot of things related to shame, I think, around illness that you and I, have overcome throughout our lives, continue to overcome.
Continue to wrestle with.
We talk about this all the time, you and I, like, that are not being foregrounded. And the fact that illness and the word disability is so complex, there are so many cultural models for it. It's not one size fits all. This is one of the most complex ideas within cultural theory, right? And it's variegated. It is locally contextual. It is temporally contextual. It is, contains the intersection of so many things. And there is scholarship about this. There are initiatives about this. So I just want you to know that you are not alone, and there is stuff to join.
Mm. You've got me thinking about so many things, Oka. Like, I'm thinking about how it's also economically contingent.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned in part 1 about my work in social care, and let's be upfront about why I had to leave social care. It's badly paid and your employment rights are really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that continues to be the case until now. So we think about the deaths of disabled people in the last 10 years, and you think about the austerity in terms of withdrawal of funding and about deteriorating working conditions of people in caring professions. I really see like a big kind of divide between the principles and the ethics of mutual aid and the way that we see neoliberal states enacting models of care, because I'm not sure I would genuinely call it care. Right. And the value attached to the lives of disabled people in terms of the care that they deserve, and also the rights of the people providing that care. Is that worthy work?
Exactly. And I think what we're doing, both of us, is trying to encourage everyone to really critically think about what is going on under the label of care. Think critically about what is going on under the label of protecting people from illness, helping people through illness. Who is enacting that? Who are they citing or not citing? Whose intellectual labor do they draw from? And as UAL is an international institution and prides itself on being such, think about how each of the institutions that we are in partnership with in the UK and around the world, think about how they are truly enacting care, what goes under the banner of care for them. And again, if it's not disability-led and if it's not chronically ill-led, there's a real issue there.
And if we're not considering, the ways that care is racialized, I'm thinking just in the current context, in the context of COVID, I think about the position of domestic workers living in the UK. I don't know how many people here are aware that for domestic workers here on a domestic worker visa, their visa that doesn't fall within the narrative. If you want to check out more about that, I really recommend Justice for Domestic Workers. Philippines, Marissa Begonia. We have to think about care in critical ways.
Yes, I think that I'm glad you brought up migration, because as a migrant myself who has to pay the hundreds of pounds of immigration health surcharge every year, I really think that as UAL is an international institution with an international contingent of faculty, staff, and students, think about how our likelihood to become ill or to perish from illness is contingent on the unfair policies of the Home Office and the hostile environment, and how it has really endangered a lot of us. I think there are people in our communities who certainly, rely on medications in the UK to survive, for instance, who have to be here for those reasons. There are people who cannot afford the medication if it's in their home country, because medications in quote unquote developing countries, the term I hate, tends to be marked up so highly. And because pain medications is often seen as non-essential, even though, it really, in so many cases, it really truly is. So the intersection of healthcare policy, immigration policy, all intersects with art school policies. And that's something that I want people to think about.
I know that there's been a lot of news coverage about deportations in the last few months, especially, but, there's so many communities and organisations that have been fighting deportation for years and actually representing disabled people under threat of just deportation for years. You know, there's the case of disabled members of the Windrush generation and being deported in the midst of health treatment. You know, there are these acts of brutality that intersect with race and with disability in such complex ways.
Especially in this pandemic, and, you know, refugees dying because there's not enough money being given to them to survive on per week, you know. These are people who, I feel as though if you think of the UAL as being part of an ivory tower that's cloistered, which it's not, you know, we have so many different communities transnationally that are part of UAL. Think about everyone who is being impacted by these unfair policies as also part of the ebbs and flows of what happens at UAL.
You know, I think to probably on time now, but to close, I guess I'd say, you know, as a professional and as a disabled person, I'm thinking a lot about the frameworks that I've worked within before and that existed in before, and which that I need to know more about. And I mentioned in part 2 about, you know, working and existing as a disabled person under the Equality Act. Mm-hmm. I guess where I'm heading now is I'm really thinking about abolition. About abolitionist thinking as divestment from punishment. I think about sanctions in relation to disabled people, you know, how many meetings I've been in as an advocate, and how abolition means divestment from that kind of punitive punishing model and investment into community and care. On that note, I'm going to put a link to Abolitionist Future's reading list, which I think is amazing. It was a really helpful resource for me when I was kind of feeling lost in what on earth do I do next.
Yes, I think abolition is an incredible note to end on. Also, I'm just going to drop in, mic drop, decolonization is not a metaphor, Tak and Yang. It involves return of resources, it involves return of land to people, and all this relates to the pandemic so very much. Reparations, absolutely. Climate justice, ecological justice, all tied in with the pandemic, it's all tied in with Black Lives Matter, and to think of these as separate crises is not addressing the point.
Thank you.
Thank you again, both of you, Oka and Annabel. So we're now going to take a final 5-minute comfort break, and when we come back, we'll go straight into the Q&A, for which we'll have about 15 minutes. If you're having any trouble posting questions or comments to the chat, please email Hannah at Decolonising. The email address is decolonising.arts at, oh, I'm going to get it wrong, Decolonising Arts Institute at arts.ac.uk. See you in 5. We'll be back here to resume promptly at 3:16. See you then. Okay, so welcome back everyone. We're now moving into the Q&A segment, for which we have just about 15 minutes. We don't have any questions in the chat as yet, but let's give it a moment for people to raise their hands. And while you're thinking about raising your hands, can I draw your attention to the hashtag Art School in a Pandemic? That's another way for people to feedback and interact with the conversations in flow. Okay, your mic is off.
Apologies. Something that I continually forget, but I'm still learning because it's never ending learning about access. It's a practice that you constantly, you know, try and keep up with, is that if you capitalize each first letter of a word, that makes it a lot easier for people who use screen readers. So if you capitalize the A in art school, the S, the I, the A, the P, that makes it a lot easier for people to differentiate between words.
Well, maybe I can come in. I don't want to close the space. I don't want to interrupt where other people's thoughts, but maybe I'll just come in with a gentle question in response to the last conversation. Of course, they're all intermeshed, the issues and questions raised across all three around crises, responses and accountabilities, and thinking about other recent conversations. This question of what is going on under the label of care, how to not perform it, but actually enact it. I wonder whether either or both of you would like to describe a good or bad example of interaction, inaction under this label that you've experienced.
Where to start, Oka?
I know. So many memories just flooding in right now. I think that with regards to the pandemic and art school in a pandemic, I think that because there is a pre-existing patina of racist experiences that some students may have experienced already before the pandemic, and faculty and staff, it becomes, I want people to understand that it is harder to advocate for yourself and to feel like you're safe enough to advocate for your own health needs, your own access needs. Again, not all disabilities are illnesses, right? That's, again, it's a very complex concept and you know, that we can both elaborate on for quite a long time. But I think that feeling supported by an art school in terms of what's happened because of this pandemic is very much related to how safe and, you know, how supported one felt before the onset of the pandemic. And to keep that in mind, that people may not, just as, you know, there are studies that have shown that NHS workers who are of color or of the majority world are more likely to pass away from COVID in the line of fire, so to speak, because of racism and because of, you know, like needs not being met, supervisors not listening, not feeling safe and secure enough, needing to provide for families and being stuck in these situations. I think that all applies to whether or not people are asking for help within the context of an art school.
Yeah, really important. And I'm thinking about my work in the disability world, both inside and outside arts education, and how there's often a lack of intersectional analysis of experiences of being a disabled person. You know, thinking about how even concepts seemingly as innocuous as self-advocacy practice amongst disabled people is often normed against whiteness. And so the kind of the issues that are deemed to be pertinent or crucial to disabled communities are seen very much through a white lens. So I think actually, you know, when I talk about how I moved from disability rights to disability justice, that was a really steep and important learning curve for me to go from looking at disability as though it's a single issue to actually understanding it as embedded in complex and interlocking global systems. You know, we can't address ableism until we address racism. And so for me, mechanisms of care have to account for all of those things. And it starts with institutional structures.
Right. I think also with regards to care, as we mentioned, it's very strange to us that within Black Lives Matter events, there's not always our Black disabled peers and colleagues, whether in the States or the UK, who are highlighted, people we know have been doing incredible work. And conversely, in the context of the pandemic, Black leaders aren't being highlighted enough either because of this notion of, again, a lack of intersectional understanding. And it's very bizarre to us, as we've both discussed among ourselves, to see these two being bifurcated as such. I think there is a statistic that says, I believe it is, okay, I have it here. On June 9th, 2020, there was an article in The Guardian by Dominic Bradley and Sarah Katz. More than a third of Americans killed by police have a disability. More than 1/3. It's time to listen to Black and disabled activists. So I really think there's, you know, Black Lives Matter and police brutality and institutional brutality is so much interweaved with the lack of disability justice and how bodies are treated according to these very cruel systems of race.
Just to let you know, we're not, in the interest of access, we're not applying pressure to people to respond in the now. And I think that's part of why we're offering the hashtag as a means of engagement. Both Orca and I are on Twitter, and as someone with a processing speed deemed outside of the norm, there are probably things going to occur to me tomorrow and in the ensuing days about this conversation. And if that's the same for you, then please let us know through the hashtag, and we'll continue this then.
Sarah V, forgive me for not attempting to mispronounce your surname.
That's okay. Hello. I actually sent an email because I couldn't access the chat. So I sent my question to Hannah because it's quite a long question. So you might want to copy and paste it into the chat.
We can see that
Hannah
now.
has
Thank
done.
you.
We can see it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Do you want me to read it as well?
Please do.
Just a second. Yeah, so I said that you quite rightly draw a link between the way disabled people have been ignored and the colonial legacy of the West. Do you think that one of the main reasons why the disabled community has not been acknowledged in this pandemic and over the decades is because to acknowledge their cause would necessitate acknowledgement of the colonial legacy that it's tied to, and that is something that the UK government simply cannot accept? And if that is the case, how can we navigate a path to enact real systemic change, or what do you see as the biggest barriers?
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think it is definitely tied to the colonial legacy, and that actually to acknowledge racialized and disabled people is to acknowledge that colonial legacy. In terms of enacting real systemic change, recently I've been probably ruminating a bit too much on this question, but something that's really helped to ground me in my practice and the potential impact of what I do and how I try to relate to others is I've been thinking a lot about emergence. I mentioned Adrienne Marie Brown earlier on in the context of explicit lineages. I really recommend her book Emergent Strategy, in terms of thinking about how the ways that we try to build and try to relate at the micro level, if we try to mimic cooperative life forms like rhizomes, like mushrooms, fractals, those kind of things, we could try to build for change on a larger level. I think there's something there around thinking about, can we build within the system, or do we have to build kind of in spite of it? And I'm that's where I'm at the moment.
I think also with regards to so much of our discussion has been about erasure, and I just want to draw attention to the fact that only 7% of Americans are on Twitter. What you see on social media, what you see in mainstream Western media isn't actually the entire world. And I feel really privileged being Indonesian in terms of, being from Jakarta and just witnessing across the archipelago so many forms of mutual aid, so many indigenous and indigenous-led conversations around care in a real sense. And I really don't want people to think, oh, we have to reinvent the wheel, right? Because for hundreds of years, because the notion of the state has been a violent one for so many communities, there have been forms of care that are systemic and are outside the mainstream systems. So I find that so many questions tend to be around, so what do we do now, as opposed to what has already been done? What efforts across the years and across the centuries indeed have been thwarted that could have really made a difference? So I think I think, as you said, Annabel, erasure is violence too. And, I don't think there should be one centralized way of quote unquote changing the world. I think that's a false Western universalist understanding of things, right? There are so many different emergent strategies around the world that have already been happening. And I think disabled indigenous-led systems are really where my heart and mind are at.
I think about emergence, you're making me think a lot, Oka, but I think about emergence in terms of, in Indonesia, for example, thinking about the relationship with nature and the kind of the spiritual aspect of nature, and how there are potential parallels, although there are clearly kind of lines drawn between trying to mimic nature or trying to exist in harmony with nature and concepts like emergent strategy that have emerged, I think, primarily in the US.
Yeah, I think a lot of my work in the past 5 years really is trying to draw attention to the fact that, we're killing off rainforests and forcing indigenous peoples from rainforests that have so many incredible medicinal needs that are that won't be made available, that are being decimated to make palm oil plantations for Western consumption, to make factories and mineral mines for Western consumption. And the role of the traditional healer, or what racists would call witch doctors, is really incredibly vital. And these people are not only not being recognized, they're being forcibly evicted from their lands and endangered and put to work in really precarious living situations.
But studied as objects by anthropologists first, no?
Yeah, and I want people to think about the ownership of healing as well, and the proprietary nature of so many pharmaceutical companies that will tend to go into a rainforest and claim something that has been used by indigenous communities for hundreds of years as their own, and who gets to access that medicine, right? Who gets to access those trials, and in what forms healing comes, the practices of it, the actual communities that are or are not involved in different forms of healing.
Both your responses to Sarah's very important and complex question point us back to the first parts of your conversation around understanding that this current crisis is a pre-existing crisis, or a set of intersecting pre-existing crises. And you asked the questions earlier of who we are and who we were. You talked about the importance of understanding lineages, histories, and without understanding then the paths by which, the intersecting, interwoven paths by which we have arrived here in this moment, we can't begin to imagine paths out from this moment. I don't want to have the last word, but I'm conscious of that we've gone over a couple of minutes already. So I wonder whether Oka and Annabel would like to say, make one last remark before we wrap up.
I'd just like to say a big thank you. Thank you to the Decolonising Arts Institute for amazing colleagues who've helped us to make this happen. Massive thank you to Oka for being
Annabel.
for being in conversation with me today. And thanks for your questions. Please do just keep this conversation going with us via the hashtag, which we'll hopefully send out as part of when we send out the recordings after the fact, so that we can keep this going and start to build new lineages, as well as locating ourselves in the old.
Thank you so much, Susan, for helping to carry this conversation along. Thank you all for attending, and thank you behind the scenes to Lucy and to Hannah and to Alin.
Thank you.
So thank you, yes, thank you everyone, to our speakers most of all, and to everyone behind the scenes for making this happen and bringing this together. Very sorry to all our attendees for the glitch with the chat. We were not aware that your questions and comments weren't coming through, but as both Annabel and Oka have said, we very much conceive of these conversations as starting points and openers. So we'll be certainly looking to see how we can continue and sustain these into and develop them into tangible actions. A brief reminder that the event has been recorded, so as has been said multiple times, but I'll say it again, the link will be circulated with all the links in the chat collated for your convenience. And we're planning to develop these conversations into a series of podcasts. So drop us a line at Decolonising Arts Institute at arts.ac.uk if you want to receive information about other events and developments. And finally, please join me in thanking Oka and Annabel. Feel free to unmute and turn on your cameras if you wish. Thank you, Oka and Annabel, again for a fantastic series of conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Clap, clap, clap.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.